Welcome to week 4, Intro to Psychology students. You've officially made it through halfway. And this week you have 2 chapters that you'll need to cover, as well as your second exam. I'm really excited for this week. The 2 chapters we'll be covering are lifespan development and motivation and emotion. So first up is chapter 9. This is our lifespan development chapter. Lifespan development studies how you change, as well as how you remain the same over the course of your life. We're going to be talking about lifespan development from many different perspectives, including your physical development. So this is your growth and changes in the body and the brain, senses, your motor skills, health and wellness. But we're also going to be talking about cognitive development, how you learn as you age, your attention and memory, your language, thinking, reasoning, and creativity as you age. And then lastly, your psychosocial development. These are your emotions and your personality and your social relationships. When trying to explain why people develop as they do, scientists usually consider 4 interactive factors. The physical development, you've got your biological forces. This includes all genetic and health-related factors that affect development. You've got psychological forces that include all internal, perceptual, cognitive, emotional, and personality factors. Your sociocultural factors. This includes interpersonal, societal, cultural, and ethnic factors. Life cycle forces. These are things that reflect differences in how the same event affects people of different ages. And one useful way that we organize all of these different perspectives is by using the biopsychosocial framework. It allows us to emphasize each one of those factors. Now, what developmental psychology or lifespan development is looking to study or explore is the normal changes in behavior that occur across the lifespan. Now, normal. That's difficult. What is normal development? Normative psychologists have studied large numbers of children to determine norms. These are average ages of when most children reach specific developmental milestones. Think crawling, walking, speaking in sentences, beginning puberty. Those things happen at norms. Biological milestones such as starting puberty are universal. Everyone goes through puberty, no matter where you've grown up through culturally. This is a universal milestone. However, social milestones, such as starting school, may vary across cultures. Some of you in this class may have gone to preschool. Some of you may not have gone to preschool and gone right on to kindergarten. Some of you may have cousins or relatives that live in different parts of the country and begin school at a different age, or even start high school or college at a different age. When we think about lifespan development, we're looking at it based upon continuous and discontinuous development. This is where developmental psychologists have different views on the process of lifespan development. Some developmental psychologists view development as a cumulative process that gradually improves on already existing skills. Think about it reasonably, like adding inches to height each year. You are continuously growing and adding inches to your height each year. You can see the example of continuous development in this graphic here, and that it just is a slow, steady incline. On the opposite, some developmental psychologists view development as discontinuous, meaning that it's done in unique stages or specific times. So at each stage, you're moving to the next stage and then the next stage. It's not gradual as continuous development is. The gradual approach might be visualized as a rainbow with one color gradually merging into the next with no bold lines separating those two. So continuous development is also known as gradual development. And it might be seen as just sort of like slowly moving from one color to the next without there being a clear break in each color. With the discontinuous approach, behavior is one step is qualitatively different from the step that preceded it, and the change from one step to the other is abrupt. Now, there is no right answer. Some features appear to be more continuous in their development course, such as the gradual development of infant temperament into later personality. Other features do seem to appear seemingly out of nowhere. Many psychologists take what we know as the universal approach to development. They look for age-related behaviors that are found across the entire human species. Then there are some psychologists who take an ecological view, asking questions about the impact of culture and environment on development. But which approach is correct, universal or ecological? Both improve our understanding of development. And although there are in fact universals in development, such as the age at which most children begin walking unassisted, we also know that children growing up in cultures where early walking is encouraged walk at a slightly younger age than children growing up in cultures where restricted infant movement is the norm. Which leads us to believe that there are actually many courses of development. We want to ask this big question: is there one course or many? Is development universal for all children, or is it individual, depending on each child's genetics and environment? Stage theories believe that the process of development is universal. And we're going to go through some of the stage theories. Now, the evidence for one course of development, studies show that children from all around the world reach language milestones in similar sequences. But the evidence for many courses also indicate that cultural differences in childcare practices, different practices can accelerate or inhibit achievement of developmental milestones. For example, we in America don't have a universal maternity-paternity leave that allows for parents to take more than 2 months off after their child is born and still be paid. Whereas many other countries do have a way for children and parents to remain together in those early years for long periods of time. That, I imagine, could show that there are actual cultural differences in how children develop. Another big debate when it comes to development is nature versus nurture. Now, hint, 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 question 1 is all about nature versus nurture for chapter 9. Nature is defined as our biology, our genetics, what we get from our parents' genetics, from our ancestors. Nurture, however, is our environment and our culture. The nature versus nurture debate considers how our personalities and traits are the result of our genetics and biological factors and how they are shaped by our environment. They allow us to ask questions like, why are siblings sometimes so different? Are adopted children more like their biological or adopted parents? Is intelligence inherited, or is it shaped by our learning experiences, or is it a combination of both? Question 1 for chapter 9 is going to ask you to pick a trait that you believe is a combination of both nature and nurture. So you may take this example of intelligence, and you might give detail of how it's influenced by our biology and our genetics, or, and on the flip side, how it's influenced by our environment and our culture. It's important that we look at the interaction between both nature and nurture. Both nature and nurture are important in development, but psychologists debate the relative contributions of each all the time. You don't need to use intelligence as your example for question 1. You could do things more physical, like athletic abilities. You could do things like your dietary habits, what you eat. You could do things like your social skills and where you might have gotten those from. Are they genetically linked and environmentally linked? Please provide examples and details. Don't just say, here's the trait and it's influenced by both. Believe me, I know. Give me evidence as to how they are influenced by both nature and nurture. Now let's go into those theories of development. Let's talk about the different theories of development. First up is the psychosexual theory created by Sigmund Freud. Freud believed that childhood experiences shape our personalities and behaviors as adults. He viewed development as discontinuous, so he viewed it like a staircase where each stage was an abrupt new stage. Through this view, he developed the stages of psychosexual development. He believed that lack of proper nurturance and parenting during a stage could lead a child to become stuck or fixated in that stage. He claimed that children's pleasure-seeking urges are focused on different erogenous zones at each of the 5 stages of development. His 5 stages of development were broken down into the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. I'm not going to dig too deep into Freud's psychosexual theory. It's in your textbook. I would love for you to read more about it. We are going to cover Freud in greater depth when we go and study personality theory, because it's going to be even more important to look at it then. After Freud, because Freud was thought as a little bit kooky, these are children and infants. The emphasis on sex and these different body parts felt a little bit out of the ordinary, let's say. So on the scene came Erikson. Erikson was a student of Freud. He made significant contributions to our understanding of identity or a unified, consistent sense of self. For Erikson, social development proceeds in stages, with each stage characterized by a fork in the road between a positive outcome and a less desired outcome. So he emphasized the social nature of our development and argued that personality development takes place across the lifespan, not just in childhood. Freud's stages end at about age 12, whereas Erikson said, oh no, they keep going. They don't just stop at 12. Think about yourselves. Do you think that you were fully developed and done at the age of 12? Not likely. Based on his belief that social interactions affect our sense of self, this was your ego identity. In each stage of Erikson's theory, there is a psychosocial task that we must master in order to feel a sense of confidence. And his stages were organized in 8 stages. The first stage being trust versus mistrust. In this trust, that basic needs such as nourishment and affection will be met. So from 0 to 1 years, an infant is trying to develop its sense of trust, that their basic needs are going to be met with nourishment and affection. Then from 1 to 3 years, the conflict occurring is autonomy versus shame or doubt. This is where they're starting to develop a sense of independence in many tasks. You might see a child not want to be picked up by their parents and sort of writhe around in their parents' arms because they're trying to develop a sense of independence. From 3 to 6 years, you've got the initiative versus guilt conflict. Taking initiative on some activities may develop guilt when unsuccessful or boundaries are overstepped. This is where you see more children being punished or learning about punishment. In stage 4, you've got industry versus inferiority. This is from 7 to 11 years. This is where they develop self-confidence and abilities when competent, or a sense of inferiority with not. You begin comparing yourself with others, potentially at 7 to 11 years. You start to notice whether you're good at something or bad at it. Stage 5 is identity versus confusion. This is around 12 to 18 years. Many of you fall right in stage 5 right now. You're experiencing with and developing an identity in roles. You're understanding your role. And you might be experiencing or experimenting with other roles and who you want to be perceived as. In stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation from 19 to 29 years. This is when you establish intimacy in relationships with others. You may form your first romantic relationship with another. You recognize your relationship with your parents as being more than just caregivers. Stage 7 is generativity versus stagnation. This is where you begin to contribute to society and be part of a family. Many of you might be having your own families. You may be in the workforce, contributing to society and engaging in different behaviors. The final stage is integrity versus despair. This is when you are 65 and up. This is when you begin to assess and make sense of life and the meaning of your contributions. You look back at your past and see how you assess how you contributed to your life and the world around you. So Erikson took things a huge step further in comparison to Freud. It's interesting to think about this given that you're smack in the middle, and I'm also smack in the middle of stage 7. So we're all experiencing Erikson's. Think about these stages throughout your lifespan. Can you identify with any of these stages? Now Erikson was a psychosocial theory. Piaget came on the scene and focused on cognitive development. He set the standard for his time. Now, more contemporary developmental psychologists do argue with Piaget's approach, especially of his view of cognitive development needing updating and revising. But he focused on children's cognitive growth and theorized that cognitive abilities develop through specific ages. He was the first to develop schemata, concepts used to categorize and interpret information, to help them understand the world. He believed that when children learn new information, they adjust their schemata through assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation meaning incorporates information into already existing schemata, so you're assimilating new information into what's already there. And accommodation is meaning to change the schemata based on new information, to take what's already existing instead of just plopping new information into that schemata, saying, let's actually change this original thought. Let's change the original thought we had. Psychologists point out that individual cognitive development can be quite variable. If Piaget is creating a theory of cognition and that everyone grows and develops through specific ages, that's difficult to do because our cognitive development really does vary. Some adults fail to achieve the ability to reason abstractly or do so only on some problems and not others. Variability like this makes cognitive development look much more gradual and continuous than in stages that Piaget suggests. He also didn't talk about any specific mechanisms responsible for moving from one stage to the next. And you can see his stages here. He believed that from 0 to 2 years, you were in that sensory motor stage. World was experienced through senses and actions. And the developmental issue during this time was called object permanence, understanding that even if something's out of sight, it still exists. For example, peekaboo is a perfect example of object permanence. The reason that game is so prevalent for 0 to 2-year-olds is because when you put your face behind your hands, they truly believe that you've disappeared. This is also where you see stranger anxiety becoming part of the developmental issue. They don't know who this person is. That's why they might be shy and clinging to their mother's legs. From ages 2 to 6 years, this is pre-operational. They begin using words and images to represent things, but lack logical reasoning. They might be able to draw a picture of a house and their family outside of it. But they might draw an extra person there, even though they don't exist. This is where pretend play comes out. Egocentrism is discovered here, unable to take the perspective of the others. It's kind of my way or the highway when you're 2 to 6 years old. Children don't like when things are being taken away from them. They begin to cry and have temper tantrums. Likely that's due to egocentrism because they're unable to take the perspective of others. They don't understand that they're about to have dinner in an hour, and that's why they have to stop eating those cookies. And language development is also seen in 2 to 6 years. Ages 7 to 11 is the concrete operational stage. You begin to understand concrete events and analogies logically. You can perform functions, mathematical transformations. You can begin having conversations. So a lot more development is occurring from 7 to 11. Then he, similar to Freud, kind of says like 12. 12 and up, formal operational. Your cognitive development is there. You begin doing formal operations. You can utilize abstract reasoning. You can think about morals, right? So you can start to have more debates around ethical and moral concerns because you can understand the points of views of others. Many psychologists believe that Piaget underestimated the capabilities of young children. But at the same time, he may have overestimated the cognitive abilities of adolescents. The human brain is not fully mature until a person's early 20s, so we would not expect full adult cognition in adolescence, as it states. For example, adolescents perceive risk as well as adults do. But unlike adults, adolescents are likely to be enticed by a large reward into selecting a very risky alternative. One of the final criticisms that Piaget came up against for this theory of cognitive development was for viewing the developing child in relative isolation from his or her family, community, and culture. Egocentrism is the only time where you think, and the stranger anxiety is really the only time when you're looking at someone's cognitive development with relation to others. And that's just not how the world works. Many of us are not isolated from our family, our community, and our culture. Those have to play a role somehow in our cognitive development. However, these criticisms really shouldn't take away from what Piaget got right. On the whole, his theory serves as a useful description of how thinking advances through the childhood and adolescent stages. So even though his critics were absolutely right and on the money, we still do need to utilize Piaget's stages for cognitive development today. Kohlberg identified 3 stages of moral development. Moral development meaning learning to discern right from wrong. Lawrence was a student of Piaget's, and he noticed that after that 12 years of age, when moral reasoning starts to become prevalent, he wanted to extend Piaget's theory of cognition to explain the development of moral reasoning. To assess changes in moral reasoning, Kohlberg presented children, adolescents, and adults with a number of ethical dilemmas. He was not so interested in the choice the participant would make in response to the dilemma as he was in the reasoning the participant provided for their choice. Children and young adolescents were typically in the pre-conventional stage, or at level 1. In this stage, children will make moral choices based on their expectations of reward and punishment. Needless to say, some individuals never progress beyond this stage. Stealing or cheating is okay as long as you don't get caught, is essentially there. Now, Kohlberg believed that during adolescence, the majority of the population moves to the next stage, also known as conventional morality, level 2. And they stay there. In this stage, rules are seen as governing moral behavior and are therefore to be followed. Conventionally, moral people are also sensitive to public opinion. They want to do the right thing so that the others will approve of their behavior. Although conventional morality adds to the stability of a society, it runs the risk of being arbitrary and rigid. In addition, history is full of situations in which local public opinion was supportive of morally abhorrent activities, such as genocide or slavery. Now, the final step of Kohlberg's moral development was the post-conventional morality, or level 3. Relatively few people, according to Kohlberg, actually attain post-conventional morality. In conjunction with the abstract reasoning of formal operations, the individual now recognizes that rules are made by human beings and can therefore be flawed. Consequently, personal standards are used as reference points. The post-conventional thinker is likely to evaluate laws and rules critically before complying with them. Now, Kohlberg as well is not without their critics. Post-conventional thinking, or reasoning, or morality, has been criticized as characteristic of males in Europe and the United States, rather than representing a universal stage of moral development. Children and adults living in the United States give responses to Kohlberg's dilemmas consistent with the other cultural emphasis on personal justice and individual rights. And other cultures place a higher priority on interpersonal factors such as duty and responsibility to others. And these values can lead to different responses to ethical dilemmas. Now, it's important that we think of development from a biological standpoint. So we're going to go through, now that we've talked about the different theories of development from some big psychologists, some big names, we're now going to go through the different stages of development, meaning aging. So literal, birth, prenatal, birth, infancy, childhood, adolescent, emerging adulthood, and adulthood. Now, the first stage of development is the prenatal development. I also want to highlight question 2. Question 2 in chapter 9 is asking what prenatal care is, not what prenatal development is, but prenatal care. Prenatal care is the care given to mothers and their growing babies while in the womb and just after birth during the prenatal stage. I want you to explain the importance of prenatal care and why it's necessary. So prenatal development is the 9 months between conception and birth. This time is full of growth and activity. The first 2 weeks are known as the germinal stage. This is the first 2 weeks following conception. The developing organism is known as a zygote. Okay? And conception occurs when sperm fertilizes an egg and forms this zygote. Zygote stands for one cell structure. The zygote divides and cells become more specialized. The dividing of the cells is a process known as mitosis. This then begins to form organs and body parts. From there, you get to the embryonic stage. Okay? This is the 3 to 8 week stage. We then transfer the zygote term to an embryo term. This happens after the zygotes have 150 cells and it travels down the fallopian tubes and implants itself in the lining of the uterus. Embryo stands for multicellular organism. You can begin to see organs function in this embryonic stage, and this is when you can begin to hear the heartbeat. Basic structures develop that will become the head, the chest, and the abdomen. And the placenta begins to form, structure connected to the uterus that provides nourishment and oxygen from the mother to the embryo via an umbilical cord. The fetal stage, which goes from weeks 9 to 40. During the fetal stage, the baby's brain develops and the body adds size and weight until the fetus reaches full-term development. You can see this diagram here, the size of the fetus as it grows. Now, there are definitely things that can have a prenatal influence. There are genetic and environmental factors that can affect development during each prenatal stage. It is important for the mother to receive prenatal care. This is medical care during pregnancy to monitor the health of the mother and fetus. Again, question 2. Make sure to review this slide. A teratogen is any environmental agent, whether it's biological, chemical, or physical, that causes damage to the developing embryo or fetus. This can include things like alcohol, which can cause fetal alcohol syndrome, smoking, which can result in premature birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, sudden infant death syndrome. Other drugs known as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, as well as prescription drugs. Or radiation and viruses, HIV, herpes, and rubella. Many times when you are put on a medication, it will ask you if you're pregnant, because it wants to know if this drug is going to have an effect on your newborn baby. The presentation digs a little bit deeper into fetal alcohol syndrome. This is a collection of birth defects associated with heavy consumption of alcohol during pregnancy. Research has found alcohol to be the leading preventable cause of mental retardation in children in the U.S. It has physical symptoms which would result in a small head size and abnormal facial features. And the cognitive results of a child born with fetal alcohol syndrome is poor judgment, poor impulse control, higher rates of ADHD, learning issues, and lower IQ scores. Once we're out of that prenatal stage and we're in the newborn stage, you begin to see newborn reflexes. These are inborn automatic responses to particular forms of stimulation. These are things that help the newborn survive. You see 4 reflexes commonly right away in newborns. The rooting reflex, which allows babies to turn their heads towards something that touches its cheek. So if you're stroking your finger along their cheek, they'll turn your head towards your finger. The sucking reflex. They're able to suck on objects placed in the mouth. Their eyes could be shut. They could have never made a peep. But if you stick a little binky in their mouths, they automatically know to suck on it. It's what allows them to feed right away from the mother's breast. The third one is the grasping reflex, clinging to objects placed in hands. Instinctively, we put our fingers out for newborns to grasp onto our fingers. And they instinctively and reflexively know to grab it. And then the Moro reflex. Baby spreads arms and pulls them back in when they are startled, feel like they are falling. Now, their sensory abilities are not yet fully developed at birth. And vision is the least developed sense. They prefer human voices, specifically their mothers, over a stranger's. And they can distinguish between the smell of their mothers and others. So their sensory abilities, though have not yet fully developed at birth, they are kicking in almost immediately after birth, which is why immediately babies are placed into the arms of their mothers so they can begin to develop their senses. Now, their physical development, growth occurs rapidly during infancy in this newborn stage, and then begins to slow down around ages 4 to 6. Girls have a growth spurt around ages 8 and 9, boys at around 12. Now, the nervous system is going through what's called the blooming period. Neural pathways form thousands of new connections during infancy and toddlerhood. And then go through a pruning period where neural connections are reduced during childhood and adolescence to allow the brain to function more efficiently. So essentially in infancy and toddlerhood, there are tons of neural pathways growing, just from the central nervous system all the way up, from the peripheral to the sun, everywhere, tons. But then once they reach childhood and adolescence, your body begins to prune away the things that are unnecessary in order to become more efficient. The size of the brain increases rapidly, especially the frontal lobe during ages 3 to 6. 55% of adult size at age 2, 90% of adult size at age 6. Your motor development and motor skills is your ability to move our bodies and manipulate objects. And this occurs in orderly sequence and becomes more advanced. Think about your motor development as continuous. Fine motor skills is your ability to focus on the muscles in our fingers, toes, and eyes and enable coordination of small actions, gripping a pencil. So first it's your fine motor skills, then going up further to gross motor skills, focusing on large muscle groups that control arms and legs and involve larger movements, balancing and running. After that, it's our cognitive development. So yes, Piaget thought that children's ability to understand objects develops slowly as a child matures and interacts with the environment. However, psychologists, more contemporary psychologists like Bailageron in 1987, viewed young children understanding objects and how they work long before they have experience with those objects. For example, in his study, infants observed a truck, in image A, roll down an unobstructed track, in image B. Rolled down an unobstructed track with an obstruction box beside it, and then rolled down and passed through what appeared to be an obstruction. Infants spent more time looking at C, image C, suggesting that they knew solid objects cannot pass through each other. So they know things about something even before they viewed it. But we want to talk about some cognitive milestones. From 6 to 9 months, babies and infants can shake their heads no, right? They have the ability to shake their head no, even if they don't know what no means. From 9 to 12 months, they can respond to verbal requests, right? Wave bye-bye, wave bye-bye, and the infant responds waving bye-bye. At 8 months, they can also understand object permanence. Toddlers understand someone will come back when they leave the room. Will look in appropriate places when asked to find objects, but at 8 months, not so much. 3 to 5 years, they can learn to count, name colors, know their name and age, can make small decisions, understand basic time concepts and sequencing, enjoy pretend play, become more curious, this is when they begin to ask why, and develop theory of mind. From 6 to 11 years, thinking becomes more logical and organized. They can understand the past, the present, and the future. They can plan and work towards goals. They can understand cause and effect relationships and basic math skills. Their attention span, however, is fairly limited until about age 11. In order to understand cognitive development, it's also important to understand attachment. Because now we're getting into the psychosocial development. So psychosocial development occurs as children form relationships and interact with others and understand and manage their feelings. The first key component of psychosocial development is attachment. Attachment is defined as a long-standing connection or bond with others. Forming healthy attachments is one of the main psychosocial milestones of infancy. Psychosocial developmental psychologists like to ask questions like, how do parent and infant attachment bonds form? How does an infant form an attachment to a parent? And does it matter if it's the mother or the father? How does neglect affect these bonds? What accounts for children's attachment differences? Some of the most influential studies conducted to answer these questions were by Harry Harlow, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth. Harlow's study separated newborn monkeys from their mothers and presented them with 2 surrogate mothers. One of the surrogate mothers was made of wire mesh but could dispense food. One was made from cloth, so it was a little bit softer to touch, but didn't dispense any food. Monkeys spent time clinging to the cloth monkey and only went to the wire monkey for food. These results suggested that feelings of comfort and security are the critical components to maternal-infant bonding, not that it's a food source. In Bowlby's attachment theory, they defined attachment as the affectional bond and tie that an infant forms with the mother. Bond must be made with primary caregiver in order to have normal social and emotional development. And they saw attachment as an all or nothing process. They created a phrase known as the secure base. Parental presence that gives a child a sense of safety as they explore their surroundings. They believed that there were two requirements for healthy attachment. The caregiver must be responsive to the child's physical, social, and emotional needs. The caregiver and child must engage in mutually enjoyable interactions. And then lastly, Mary Ainsworth wanted to ask the question, do children differ in the way they bond? And if so, why? Ainsworth looked to answer this question through a procedure known as the strange situation. Mother, or caregiver, depending upon whether the mother was present or not, and infant are placed in a room together with toys. Then a stranger enters the room and the mother leaves, or caregiver leaves. After a few minutes, caregiver returns to the room to comfort the child. Through the strange situation, Ainsworth identified 3 styles of attachment, and then a 4th was later identified. The first style was secure. The child uses the parent as a secure base from which to explore. So this is Ainsworth kind of expanding upon Bowlby's theory of the secure base. Child became distressed when the mother left, happy to see them when they returned. And this is common when caregivers are sensitive and responsive to their needs. The second type was avoidant. They're unresponsive to the parent. They don't use them as a secure base and does not care when they leave. In these cases, the child was slow to show positive reaction when mother returned. Common when caregivers are insensitive and inattentive to their needs. 3 is resistant, showing clingy behavior, but then rejected mother's attempts to interact with them. So the child did not explore the toys, became extremely disturbed and angry when mother left, and were difficult to comfort when mother returned. This is common when caregivers is inconsistent with level of response. And the 4th one that was discovered later on was disorganized, meaning that they show odd behavior around the caregiver. They behave oddly when the mother left, froze, ran around erratically, tried to run away when mother returned. This is common when a child has been abused. The psychosocial conflict or psychosocial development also looks at self-concept or self-awareness, not just attachment. Self-concept is the development of a positive sense of self. This is the main psychosocial milestone of childhood. Children with positive self-concept tend to be more confident, more independent, do better in school, and are more willing to try new activities. By 18 months, a baby can recognize themselves in the mirror. By 24 to 46 months, they can recognize themselves in a photo. Now, if we look at self-concepts as it relates to social behavior, children do begin to display increased social behavior after establishing a self-concept. So if a child isn't being social, it could be a result of not having established a self-concept. By ages 2 to 4, they enjoy playing with other children. They can label themselves as boy or girl. Through play, children explore and come to understand gender roles. At age 4, they can cooperate and share with others. They can initiate tasks and carry out plans. At age 6, they can identify themselves in terms of group membership. And the third thing is parenting styles. The development of a healthy concept can depend on parenting styles. So psychosocial development also wanted to look at and understand how a parent's parenting style can influence their psychosocial development. Baumrind in 1971 created 4 different parenting styles. The first is the authoritative style. Parents give children reasonable demands and consistent limits, express warmth and affection, and listen to a child's point of view. The second is the authoritarian style. Parents place a high value on conformity and obedience, are often rigid, and express little warmth to the child. You then have permissive style. Parents make few demands and rarely use punishment. And then you have the uninvolved style. Parents are indifferent, uninvolved, and sometimes referred to as neglectful. They don't respond to the child's needs and may make relatively few demands. Think about your own parents or guardians or caregivers, and if they fall into one of these 4 categories of parenting styles. and how that may have influenced your psychosocial development as you aged. And last for psychosocial development is temperament. Parenting style can depend on the temperament of a child. Temperament is the innate traits that influence how one thinks, behaves, and reacts with the environment. Easy temperament is positive emotions, adaptable to change, and capable of regulating emotions. They're more likely to elicit warm and responsive parenting. A difficult temperament to child, one with negative emotions, difficulty adapting to change, and regulating their emotions, will more likely to evoke irritation and cause parents to withdraw. Now we then want to look at adolescence. In our adolescence, peers are a primary influence on our development in adolescence. Physically, however, this is when puberty begins to occur. Adrenarche is maturing of the adrenal glands, and gonadarche is maturing of the sex glands. This is when your secondary sexual characteristics begin to develop: breasts and hips in girls, and facial hair and deepened voices in boys. And menarche is beginning of the menstrual periods. This is usually around 12 to 13 years old for females. And spermarche is their first ejaculation for boys, which is around 13 to 14 years old. But both sexes have growth spurts. Girls reach their adult height by 16, and boys reach their adult height by 17. Now, we can't think about physical development without talking about the brain and its growth. Brain growth continues into the early 20s. The development of the frontal lobe in particular is important during this stage. The frontal lobe is what's responsible for judgment, impulse control, and planning. This may explain why adolescents engage in increased risk-taking behaviors and emotional outbursts during their adolescent stages because of the amount of growth happening in the frontal lobe. In adolescence, cognitive development is different as well. Teenage thinking is characterized by the ability to reason logically and solve hypothetical problems, such as how to design, plan, and build a structure. You might find more group projects happening in this time frame, and more actual physical projects taking place. You might begin having to do research projects. This is when you start to see high schools and schools offering science fairs, things like that. Some researchers believe that this is due to an increase in mental capacity. You have the ability and development of new skills. Other researchers, however, believe this is due to increases in processing speed and efficiency. So it's not just the development of new skills, but actually rather the improvement on old ones. In this stage, you also have cognitive empathy, the ability to take the perspective of others and feel concern for others. This increases in adolescence and an important part of social problem solving and conflict avoidance. You might see high schools and junior highs having peer mediator programs because students are actually able to start engaging in these kinds of conversations. With regards to psychosocial development in adolescence refines their sense of self as they relate to others. Who am I? Who do I want to be? They may adopt the values and roles that parents expect for them, but they also may develop identities that are in opposition to their parents, but align with a peer group. Peer relationships become a central focus in adolescents' lives. And according to Erikson, adolescents are in the identity versus role confusion stage. Teens may experiment while they figure out what their identity is. Parent and child relationships. Warm, healthy parent-child relationships have been associated with better grades, fewer school behavior problems during the adolescent stage. From adolescence, we then go into emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is question 3 in chapter 9. I want you to define what emerging adulthood is. Okay, so it's a relatively newly defined period of lifespan development of 18 years to the mid-20s. So around 18 to 25 years. And its identity exploration is focused on work and love. And it helps us to answer the question of why are people taking longer to grow up? The reason emerging adulthood became a stage of development was because it was a product of Western culture in current times. People are living longer, allowing them extra time to start a career and family. They're also requiring higher levels of education, right? Many of you may go into career fields that require graduate degrees, meaning you're not just going to college for 4 years, but then you have an additional 2 years of schooling after that. There's also higher cultural value placed on taking time to explore options. So many people these days, after they graduate college, they take a year to go backpacking. They discover traveling and exploring things before settling down. After adulthood, or emerging adulthood, you have adulthood. Now, the physical development in adulthood from the 20s to 40s, your physical abilities are typically at their peak from 20 to 40 years old. Middle adulthood, which is your 40s to 60s, you begin to see a physical decline, which is gradual. Your skin loses elasticity, wrinkles begin to form, visual acuity decreases, so your vision might get worse and you might have to get glasses. Women might begin to experience menopause. Men and women both tend to gain weight. Hair begins to thin and turn gray. Late adulthood, which is 60 plus, skin continues to lose elasticity. Reaction time slows further. Have you ever tossed anything in your grandpa or grandma's direction? Their ability to catch it, not likely. Muscle strength diminishes. Smell, taste, and hearing and vision decline. Physical declines of middle and late adulthood can be minimized with proper exercise, nutrition, and an active lifestyle. Now, cognitive development as you reach adulthood, cognitive abilities remain steady throughout early and middle adulthood. They have what's called crystallized intelligence, information, skills, and strategies gathered through experience. This remains steady or improves. Fluid intelligence, which is information processing abilities, reasoning, and memory, this, however, begins to decline. So as we age, these two types of intelligence begin to sort of either decline if fluid, or go up or improve if crystallized. Cognitive abilities such as playing mahjong, chess, or other games can keep you mentally fit and delay cognitive abilities. The same is true for solo pastimes like reading and completing crossword puzzles. I cannot tell you the number of crossword puzzles my grandfather does. Now, with regards to their psychosocial development in these stages, there is belief that as we age, we need to continue to have meaning in our lives. Many adults define themselves by their job or relationships with family. Employment and well-being. Job satisfaction is closely tied to work that involves contact with other people, is interesting, provides opportunities for advancement, and allows for some independence. With regards to relationship and well-being, positive influences on well-being include having a stable marriage, having children, initially stressful but rewarding later on. Now, socio-emotional selectivity theory. As we get older, our social support and friendships dwindle in number, but remain as close, if not more close, than our earlier years. It's because we're selectively approaching who we're with socially. We may not have as many friends as we had when we were teenagers when we get older, but those relationships that we do have are really close and incredibly strong. Now, we can talk about development without also mentioning death and dying. Culture and individual backgrounds influence how we view death. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, however, created the 5 stages of grief, which is question 4 this week. The 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. The question is going to ask you to define what each of these stages mean, and then give an example of how someone is behaving in each of these stages. So what's happening in the denial stage? What's happening in the anger stage? Provide an example of each of those stages for question 4. Death and dying is different based upon culture, society, and religions. People's bodies may be buried in a cemetery, cremated and buried at sea, as in this U.S. Navy ceremony that you see in image B, or cremated such as this Hindu ceremony in Bali. Many different cultures take death and dying in a different way. Excellent. So I've wrapped up all 4 questions for chapter 9 as I lectured. Make sure that you Rewatch this lecture as you need to when it comes time to answer your questions. Okay, so our second chapter of this week is chapter 10. Chapter 10 is all about motivation and emotion. Emotions can change in an instant, in a snap, especially in response to an unexpected event. Surprise, fear, anger, and sadness are some immediate emotions that people experience in the aftermath of the April 15th, 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. This chapter aims to answer what are emotions, what causes them, what motivated some bystanders to immediately help others in situations like the Boston bombing, while other people ran for safety, potentially. So first we need to talk about motivation. Motivation is defined as the wants or needs that direct behavior toward a goal. We break motivation down into two types. There are two types of motivation. You have intrinsic motivation, which is where it arises from internal factors. Behaviors are performed because they bring a sense of personal satisfaction. And you have extrinsic motivation. These arise from external factors. Behaviors are performed in order to receive something from others. So, extrinsic motivators are from the outside, things like compensation, punishment, reward. Intrinsic motivation, however, from within is autonomy, a sense of purpose, a sense of mastery. So there are two types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, when we look at them deeper, we look at things like the overjustification effect. This is when intrinsic motivation is diminished when extrinsic motivation is given. So research suggests that when something we love to do, like icing cakes, becomes our job, our intrinsic and extrinsic motivations to do it may change. Once we are receiving an intrinsic motivation, like being paid, we may lose the motivation to do it just for pleasure or enjoyment. We no longer wish to be the master at it because all that matters is that we're getting paid. Other research, however, suggests the opposite, that certain types of reinforcement, such as praise, can increase our intrinsic motivation. Now, the explanation of the differences, one is in the type of reinforcement. Tangible rewards appear to decrease our intrinsic motivation. Tangible meaning physical. Paychecks. Think paychecks. Intangible rewards, however, appear to increase our motivation. Intangible means non-physical. Praise from others. Recognition. The second explanation for this difference is expectation of the extrinsic reward. Intrinsic motivation is more likely to decrease if extrinsic reward is expected. If you know it's coming, you may feel less likely to be intrinsically motivated. Now, there are three distinctive theories of motivation, and this is going to come in handy for question 1. The first theory of motivation was proposed by William James. He proposed the instinct theory of motivation, asserting that behavior is driven by instincts, which aid survival. He proposed that instincts included a mother's protection of her baby, the urge to lick sugar, and hunting prey. The theory, however, received criticism for ignoring the role of learning in shaping human behavior. This was the earliest view on motivation, right? William James was way back in the beginning. It was also heavily influenced by Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection. According to James, instincts are impulses from within a person that direct or motivate that person's behavior. James proposed that we motivated by more than 35 different innate instincts, including impulse to love, fight, imitate, talk, and acquire things. One problem with James's view, however, was that the list of proposed instincts kept getting longer and longer, and it seemed unrealistic to argue that all behavior is due to instincts. Furthermore, it is impossible to determine whether many of the proposed instincts are inborn. Many of James' so-called instincts, such as being sympathetic or being secretive, may result from learning. Because of this, we then created the drive theory of motivation. Drive theory proposed that the maintenance of homeostasis is important to directing behaviors. According to the drive reduction approach, motivation stems from the desire to reduce an uncomfortable internal state called a drive that results when our needs are not fulfilled. Primary drives, such as needing food, water, warmth, motivate us to maintain certain bodily processes as an internal state of equilibrium or homeostasis. Obviously, it would be desirable for us to take in just the right amount of food and water, to sleep just enough, and to maintain our body temperature at 98.6 degrees. To achieve homeostasis, organisms actively defend certain values, known as set points. Under normal circumstances, we carefully regulate such variables as core body temperature, fluid levels, and body weight around these set points. Deviations from these set points stimulate behavior by the organism that is designed to reestablish the original values. So we are constantly working to reach homeostasis, or these set points. And when we aren't at homeostasis or at these set points, our organisms, meaning ourselves, stimulate behavior to meet the need and bring the system back to homeostasis. This particular theory emphasizes the role that habits or patterns of behavior, which we regularly engage in, play in our behavioral responses. Our primary drive states begin in the body when the brain recognizes that we are lacking in some biological need. If our behavior successfully reduces a drive, we are more likely to engage in that behavior in the future. The third theory of emotion is the arousal theory of emotion. The arousal theory asserts that there is an optimal level of arousal that we're all trying to maintain. And if you look at it on a graph, the peak of the line, the blue line, is the optimal level. And research suggests that the optimal level of arousal for performance is moderate arousal. So it's not high, it's not incredibly high, it's somewhere in the middle. When arousal is low, you are in a state of boredom and you seek stimulation. When you're over-aroused, you're actually feeling a sense of high anxiety and you engage in behaviors to reduce that arousal. So you might stay in bed. You might stay indoors. You might not engage in social activities. The concept of optimal arousal in relation to performance on a task is depicted here. Performance is maximized at the optimal level of arousal, and it tapers off during under and over arousal. So question 3 is asking you, to choose one of these 3 theories, so either drive, instinct, or arousal theory of emotion, to explain why you're motivated to get good grades. If we look deeper at the arousal theory of motivation, Yerkes and Dodson created this in 1908. The optimal arousal level does depend on the complexity and difficulty of the task to be performed. Task performance is best when arousal levels are in middle range, with difficult tasks best performed under low levels of arousal and simple tasks best performed under higher levels of arousal. According to the arousal theory of motivation, each of us is motivated to seek out arousal when we find ourselves under-aroused and to reduce our arousal level when we are over-aroused. If we're talking about motivation, it's also important to talk about self-efficacy and social motivation. Self-efficacy is an individual's belief in her own capabilities to complete a task. Albert Bandura theorized that self-efficacy plays a role in motivating our behavior. They argued that motivation derives from expectations held about the consequences of our behaviors. Beliefs about our abilities will determine what we do and goals we set for ourselves. He also looked at social motives. This included the need for achievement, drives accomplishment and performance. Our need for affiliation encourages positive interactions with others, and our need for intimacy, which causes us to seek deep, meaningful relationships. Which leads us to Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a way to motivate our behavior. This is going to be relevant when it comes to question 2. Maslow proposed a theory of motivation that spans the spectrum of motives, including biological, individual, and social. One must satisfy lower level needs before addressing the needs in higher levels. You can also use Maslow to answer question 1. But it's really, really key for question 2. One must satisfy lower level needs before addressing the needs in higher levels. A person without food, water, and shelter is unlikely to be able to focus on relationships or what people think of them. The lowest level is the base of the pyramid. These are our physiological needs: hunger, thirst, and so on. Maslow theorized that we seek to satisfy such basic needs as hunger and need for warmth before we are motivated to satisfy any of our other needs. If our physiological needs are met, then our next level of concern is satisfying safety needs, such as having a safe place to live, out of danger, feeling secure and safe. At the next level, Maslow identified belongingness and love needs, the motivation to be with others, to be loved and to be appreciated by others. The next level we seek to successfully satisfy are our esteem needs, cognitive needs, and aesthetic needs. The esteem needs are to achieve, be competent, and gain approval and recognition. Our cognitive needs are to know, understand, and explore. Our aesthetic needs are for symmetry, order, and beauty. And if we meet our aesthetic needs, we may seek to move to even higher levels towards self-fulfillment or self-actualization, to find self-fulfillment and realize one's potentials. It includes spiritual fulfillment as well. And then the peak is transcendence. At first glance, this hierarchy seems to make sense. If you're starving, you will probably be less concerned with whether people love you and more concerned with finding food. However, much of the work of Maslow's hierarchy of needs has failed to generate strong support for his theory. In fact, we often seem to behave in ways that contradict Maslow's notion that we must fulfill lower needs before we are concerned with higher order needs. For instance, have you ever gone without lunch to pursue some other activity, such as studying for an exam? Of course. In that case, you were motivated by esteem needs, even though your physiological needs had not been met. Likewise, research also indicates that when we have satisfied our needs at a certain level of the hierarchy, we do not always move up to the next level and attempt to satisfy the next needs. Question 2 is going to ask you that if you were to win the lottery and all of a sudden have a whole boatload of money, how would your needs change? I want you to think about this particular pyramid as you answer that question. Many of students have answered that question to state that their needs would change and that they would no longer need to do anything. They're good. They got all the money in the world. It will help get them through the world. But think about some of your needs. Would your esteem needs go away? Would your belongingness needs to go away? You probably would have your physiological and safety needs met because you've got the money to feel secure and safe and out of danger, and to provide food and water. But that doesn't mean that you don't still need to know that you can achieve and be loved and affiliate with others. So think about that as you answer that question. When talking about motivation and emotions, we also want to make sure that we understand hunger and eating. Why are we motivated to eat? What makes us hungry? It is an emotional state, and it is encompassed within motivation. So much of our needs are around hunger and eating. The physiological mechanism of eating and hunger is hunger and eating are regulated by a complex interplay of hunger and satiety signals that are integrated in the brain. Before eating, you have an empty stomach. The stomach contracts, which create hunger pangs and secretion of chemical messages that travel to the brain as a signal to initiate feeding behavior. In step 2, low blood glucose levels, pancreas, liver generate chemical signals that induce hunger to initiate eating behavior. Then after eating, you experience cessation, feeling of fullness and satisfaction causing eating behavior to stop. This involves increase in blood glucose levels, which allow the pancreas and liver to send signals to shut off hunger and eating. Food passes through the gastrointestinal tract, and satiety signals are sent to the brain. Fat cells release leptin, which is also secreting the cessation hormone. Now, metabolism and body weight. There are some factors that affect your body weight. You have your gene-environment interactions, right? We talked about that in the developmental chapter. Your genetics and your environment all interact to create your body weight. Numbers of calories consumed versus numbers of calories burned in daily activity is where your body weight comes from. Additionally, your metabolic rate, the amount of energy that is expended in a given period of time. And this varies between individuals. People with a high metabolic rate burn off calories more easily than those with lower rates of metabolism. And if we want to look at the regulation of body weight, we want to understand the set point theory. Each individual has an ideal body weight or set point, which is resistant to change. That set point is genetically determined, right? We talked about that a little bit in the drive theory of motivation. This set point is genetically determined. Efforts to move weight significantly from the set point are resisted by compensatory changes in energy intake and expenditure, right? Set point is essentially homeostasis for us. Our body is trying to reach the set point. Based on the observation that people's weight generally fluctuates within a narrow margin, and it fails to account for the influence of social and environmental factors. This oftentimes is what leads to obesity. 2/3 of U.S. adults struggle with issues related to being overweight. This chart shows how adult BMI is calculated, BMI being the body mass index. Individuals find their height on the y-axis and their weight on the x-axis to determine their BMI. So 25 to 29.9 is overweight, over 30 is obese, and over 40 is morbidly obese. This BMI chart has not changed for many, many years, which means a lot of people do not trust the BMI index. Many doctors still don't even refer to the BMI index. Now, environmental factors that influence obesity are things like genetics, energy intake, expenditure, socioeconomic status, and the physical environment can also contribute to obesity. You may not feel comfortable walking or biking in a neighborhood with high crime rates, which physically limits your physical activity. You may not be able to afford healthy food options. Some other health risks of obesity are cardiovascular disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, breast cancer, infertility, arthritis, liver disease, sleep apnea, and colon cancer. Weight reduction is essentially a combination of diet and exercise. And many people who are obese might actually get bariatric surgery, which is gastric banding surgery, creating a small pouch of stomach, reducing the size of the stomach that can be used for digestion. But this can also lead to eating disorders. Many times when our motivation and our emotions are involved when it comes to hunger, eating disorders can occur. First one being bulimia nervosa. This involves engaging in binge eating behavior, followed by attempts to compensate for the large amount of food consumed. Compensation can include vomiting, laxatives, or excessive exercise. Health consequences of bulimia can include kidney failure, heart failure, and tooth decay. Psychological problems, depression, anxiety, increased risk for substance abuse. Second type of eating disorder is anorexia nervosa. Maintenance of body weight below average through starvation and/or exercise. Oftentimes, this is caused by a distorted body image. They view themselves as fat, even though they are not. Some of the health consequences can include bone loss, heart failure, kidney failure, amenorrhea, which is a cessation of the menstrual period, reduced function of the gonads, in some cases, death. The psychological problems are anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and substance abuse. Caucasian females ages 15 to 19 from Western societies are the most at-risk population. Contributing factors is many blame the media for its messages of a thin ideal. Genetics may also predispose people to these disorders. Low self-esteem or mental illnesses, life transitions and stress, experiences such as abuse and bullying, and personality types. So if you're a perfectionist, this can contribute to if you have an eating disorder, and family issues. Now, motivation also drives sexual behavior. The physiological mechanism is that the hypothalamus in your brain plays an important role in motivated behavior, which includes sex. Lesions to the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus completely disrupt a male rat's ability to engage in sexual behavior, but does not affect sexual motivation, meaning that the rat will still seek to gain access to sexually receptive females. He just can't engage in sex once he gets there. This suggests that the ability to engage in sexual behavior and the motivation to do so are mediated by different systems in the brain. In humans, disorders that involve abnormal hypothalamic function are often associated with hypogonadism, reduced function of the gonads, and reduced sexual function. Hormones secreted by endocrine glands, this is your testosterone, influence sexual motivation and behavior. So your brain is what allows you to physically have sex, but it's your hormones, which are secreted by your endocrine glands, that actually motivate you to engage in sexual behavior. The amygdala and the nucleus accumbens involved in motivation for sexual behavior, but do not affect the ability to engage in it. Damage in rats results in decreased motivation to engage in sexual behavior, while ability to do so is still intact. So the opposite is occurring from what we just said. Now, Alfred Kinsey, initiated a large-scale survey in response to the lack of empirically based information on sex during the late 1940s. It was unheard of to talk about sex back then. But Kinsey thought, we've got to know more. Behaviors thought to be rare were revealed to be much more common than previously thought. Influential in shaping future research on human sexual behavior and motivation. Some of Kinsey's findings were that women are as interested and experienced in sex as men. Both males and females masturbate without negative health consequences, and homosexual acts are actually fairly common. Through his findings, he created the Kinsey scale. This was used to categorize an individual's sexual orientation. From there, Masters and Johnson also conducted a study of physiological responses during sexual behavior. They observed people engaging in sex, measured physiological variables, meaning their blood pressure and their respiration rate, but also their sexual arousal, vaginal lubrication, and penile tumescence. They then determined what was called the sexual response cycle, beginning first with excitement, so this is the arousal phase, including erection and lubrication, Going on to the second phase, or plateau, which was increased swelling and blood flow to labia minora and pre-ejaculatory fluid. To the third phase, which was orgasm, which is rhythmic contractions and ejaculation. And fourth, which was resolution, which was returning to the unaroused state. Kinsey's research is what developed a scale of sexual orientation. Now, sexual orientation is defined as emotional and erotic attraction toward another individual. A relatively stable characteristic of a person, not a choice. Between 3% and 10% of the adult population identifies as homosexual. And we ask the question, what makes someone heterosexual versus homosexual? Previously thought to be caused by different socialization and familial experiences, but research shows that these experiences can be very similar in homosexuals and heterosexuals. And the genetics and biological mechanisms behind that. Research has found differences in brain structures and function between heterosexuals and homosexuals. Now, gender identity is different than sexual orientation. Gender identity is one sense of being male or female. In most cases, our gender identities correspond to our biological sex, but not always. Gender dysphoria is diagnosis describing individuals who do not identify as the gender that most people would assume they are. Must persist for at least 6 months, must result in significant distress or dysfunction to meet diagnosis criteria. This is where you end up getting transgender hormone therapy. The use of hormones to make one's body look more like the opposite sex, meaning more like the sex or the gender that they identify with. Chaz Bono, a transgender male, is a well-known person who transitioned from female to male. In the 1970s, the world knew Chaz as Chastity Bono, the daughter of the famous entertaining duo Sonny and Cher. Here, young Chastity is pictured with her father Sonny. Later in life, Chaz transitioned to align his physical body with his gender identity of male. One more common known one from today is actress Laverne Cox. They are openly transgender, is the first transgender actress to portray a transgender character on a regular television series, also known as Orange is the New Black. She's also an advocate for LGBTQ+ issues outside of their career, such as in Ain't I a Woman speaking tour. Now for the theories of emotion. First, we need to define the difference between emotion and mood. Mood is a prolonged, less intense, affective state. This does not occur in response to something we experience. It may not be consciously recognized or intentional. It just happens to be our mood. Emotion, however, is a little bit different. This is a subjective state of being that we often use to describe our feelings. It is relatively intense and occurs in response to an experience. It's also consciously experienced and intentional. Some of the components of emotion are our physiological arousal, our psychological appraisal, and our subjective experiences. It's informed by experiences, backgrounds, and cultures. If you look at this picture of these two toddlers, you can clearly see that toddlers can cycle through emotions very quickly, being A, extremely happy one moment, and B, extremely sad the next. Now, there are 4 theories of emotions we're going to cover, and then your last 2 questions for this chapter are going to be focused on those 4 theories. So the first theory of emotion was the James Lange theory. James Lange were 2 psychologists that believed that emotions arise from our physiological arousal. So if we look at the example of seeing a snake, we see a snake, our heart and respiration rate increases, meaning physiological arousal occurs, and then we experience the feeling of fear. And the feeling of fear is the emotion. So our senses take in the snake, our physiological body arouses, heart rate, respiration, and then our emotions come into play. Now, different from that is the Cannon-Bard theory. two psychologists that basically stated that physiological arousal and emotion experience actually occur at the same time, but independently, meaning that they occur at the same time, but are independent of each other. Meaning that someone sees a snake, they separately experience the physiological arousal and separately experience fear. And the empirical findings that led to these two theories is that individuals with spinal cord injuries, meaning that they were capable of receiving autonomic feedback, could still experience emotion, but in some it was less intense, meaning physiological had nothing to do with their ability to still experience an emotion. Suppression of facial expressions of emotion lowered the intensity of emotions experienced. These findings suggest that physiological arousal is not necessary to experience emotion, but do, however, increase its intensity. Then came into play the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory. These two psychologists believe that emotions are composed of two factors, physiological and cognitive. They believe that physiological arousal is interpreted in context leading to the emotional experience. So if we go back to the original example, you see a snake. This then creates physiological arousal, and a cognitive assessment of the situation labels arousal as fear, and then you experience fear. They believed that physiological arousal is very similar across the different types of emotion, making cognitive assessment incredibly important. They believed that physiological arousal across all of the different types, whether it's fear, sadness, happiness, physically, your palms are going to sweat, your heart's going to race, you're going to have increased respiration. That's going to happen no matter what emotion you're feeling. Then a lot has to happen in addition to the physiological arousal in order for you to experience a specific type of emotion. You have to cognitively appraise the situation. You have to be able to label that as something that is to be feared in order to experience the fear. And the last model or theory of emotion is that emotions are determined by our appraisal of the stimulus. Unlike the Schachter-Singer model, the appraisal occurs before the label. Appraisal is immediate and unconscious. If we look at this from a diagram, you have the snake and then you have the reaction. And you can see the James Lange theory has the arousal, has the heart pounding and sweating, and has the fear. Cannon-Bard has the arousal, but then at the same time that their heart pounds, the fear also is introduced. The emotion is introduced. With Schachter-Singer, you have the arousal, then you have the heart pounding and the physiological response, as well as the cognitive label. This is scary, or I'm scared. And it sort of cycles through one another. And then you have the fear response and the emotion of fear. With Lazarus' cognitive mediation model, you have the arousal of seeing the snake, you appraise that snake, and then you fear and heart pounding is happening all at the same time. So the physiological stuff is moved totally to the end. For questions 3 and 4 on chapter 10, it's going to be asking you to describe happiness with regards to these 4 emotions. So describe happiness from James Lange, Cannon-Bard, Schachter-Singer, and then Lazarus. And then question 4 is going to be to describe love and falling in love based upon these 4 theories individually. When we think about emotions from a biological standpoint, we're thinking about the limbic system, which is involved in mediating emotional responses and memory. So much of our emotional responses are tied to our memory and our cognition of things. So the hypothalamus is involved in activating the sympathetic nervous system. So this is part of your emotional reaction is engaged with the hypothalamus. The thalamus is the sensory relay center. Neurons project to both the amygdala and higher cortical regions for further processing. And then your amygdala plays a role in processing emotional information and sending it to cortical structures. And the hippocampus integrates emotional experience with cognition. If we break it down even further, the amygdala has been a primary target of research concerning the biological basis for emotions. especially when it comes to fear and anxiety. The amygdala is composed of various subnuclei, including the basolateral complex and the central nucleus. The basolateral complex has dense connections with a different sensory area of the brain. It's critical for classical conditioning and attaching emotional value to learning processes and memory. It's what attaches value, specifically emotional value, to what we learn and what we know and understand. The central nucleus part of the amygdala, however, is involved in attention, has connections with the hypothalamus and various brainstem area to regulate the autonomic nervous system and endocrine system activities. Paying attention, being stimulated by our neurotransmitters in order to provide attention. Now, facial expression and recognition of emotion is important. There's a cultural display rule. Culturally specific standards that govern the types of frequencies of displays of emotions that are acceptable. Individuals from the US express negative emotions like fear, anger, and disgust, both alone and in the presence of others. However, individuals from Japan only express these emotions while alone. Despite varying cultural display rules, recognition and production of facial expressions of certain emotions are universal, but the display rules are different based upon your cultural background. These are the 7 universal facial expressions of emotions. You've got happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger. And the facial feedback hypothesis with concerns to emotion is asking questions similar: does smiling make you happy? Or does being happy make you smile? The hypothesis states that facial expressions are capable of influencing our emotions. The support for this is depressed individuals reported less depression after paralysis of their frowning muscles using Botox injections. Meaning that using the facial feedback hypothesis, you have an emotional stimulus that creates a facial expression that creates a physiological arousal, which creates an emotional experience. If you have any questions about this week's lecture, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I did a little bit differently this time in the lecture in that I integrated the questions into the lecture so that as I was speaking about things that I wanted you to use to answer questions, I was breaking to talk about them. So you're really going to have to listen to the whole lecture in order to gain insight into your weekly questions this week. Best of luck on your exam. You have 2 opportunities to take the exam to receive the highest grade possible. So if you didn't take the first exam twice and you want to go back and retake it, you're welcome to. And if you want to take the second exam this week that will be due twice, you can for the highest grade possible as well. I wish you all the best of luck. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email at nwest@westfield.ma.edu. Excellent. Have a great week.